Anderson. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for the Study of the Middle East. And we are pleased to present today's panel on Syria. One of the things I've noticed over the last few days is large number of journalists who've spoken about how quickly the regime fell. But I'm an historian. By my count, it's taken quite a while. March 2011, I believe, was when the first demonstrations began against the government of Bashar al-Assad. And this is now, what, 13 and a half years later. So not rapid in my book. I suppose it's rapid in theological time. At any rate, it's wonderful to have you all here, even under these difficult circumstances. Before I begin, the Center for the Study of the Middle East is funded by a Title VI National Resource Center grant, funded by the U.S. Department of Education. They are interested in getting feedback from our audiences, and there are QR codes on the tables at the end or in the middle or whatever. Feel free to scan those QR codes and answer a short survey. We would appreciate your feedback. There is some coffee and some tea for those of you who can make it to that corner. Let me introduce our three panelists. First is Professor Alsaleh from Middle East Languages and Cultures Department, the chair actually of the department at the moment. There's Ambassador Feisal Istrabadi, who is the director of the Center for the Study of the Middle East and faculty in Central Eurasian Studies, and Hussein Banai, who is professor in International Studies. And I think what we'll do is we'll go about 15 minutes per person, and then at the end we'll have ample time for questions and discussion. And so let us start with you, Professor Alsaleh.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thanks, Ambassador Istrabadi, for organizing this on the spur of the moment. And thanks for your attendance, students, faculty, staff. This is obviously personal for me. I come from Syria. I moved to the United States 2003. And since then, I've been obviously a close observer of what's going on in Syria. Also, I had the experience of the Syrian regime, Assad family. Since I was a child, we were repeatedly told in the school that he's the greatest leader, and we have to see his picture every day, his quotes on our school walls. We have to pledge allegiance to him personally every morning in our schools. And all of a sudden, within 11 days recently, his regime collapsed. We, I would say, as a Syrian community here, as well as the community that I have been in contact with, we had mixed feelings. Obviously, the first feeling would be elation, because we were receiving the news with great happiness that the regime is finally collapsing, and the head of the regime is now retrieving. This caricature from 2011, written by a world-known caricature cartoonist in Syria called Ali Farzad. This is a daring picture because he did that inside Syria in 2011. Some of you were not aware of this, but there were what we called Arab Spring revolutions that started in Tunisia, moved to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria. When it came to Syria, a lot of observers said this is the fall, not the spring of the Arab Spring, because it went so bloody in Syria that a lot of people thought maybe it would have been better for Syrians not to start revolting against a very strong, very ruthless regime, Assad family or dynasty. In this picture, Assad the father was thought, a lot of people hoped that he would flee the country and in the aftermath of the revolutions, because he saw other dictators fleeing the country, including the president of Tunisia, Zainuddin bin Ali, the Gaddafi regime in Libya, Hosni Mubarak, even in Yemen. So a lot of people thought and hoped that he would lead the country. What's funny here, his son Because his son has seen his grandfather president of Syria in a Republican constitutional country, not in a monarchy. So that was against the constitution. His father is fleeing Bashar Assad. His son is saying, no, you cannot flee. It's my turn in the future to be president. I want to be president as well. My grandfather was president. You are a president. You cannot leave the country. I want to have my turn in the future. He is now the grandson, the son of Bashar al-Assad, 20 years old. A lot of Syrians a month ago were expecting him to be the next president after his father, Bashar al-Assad. What happened since then? Move to the next map. Syria went into obviously a very devastating civil war. A lot of players came into the scene, mostly external players. If you look at the map, if we can expand it even bigger. I don't know if we can, but if not, if you look at the map, you will see how many dots there representing.
Oh, that's too large.
And you can even minimize this or make it disappear, who's watching us. You know, it's lovely to see some familiar faces. Obviously, the signage is there. You can see, for example, the Turkish presence in Syria in the north, all the way around Idlib, because Idlib has been controlled by rebels supported by Turkey. In the agreement with the Russians, and the Russians are already there, represented by the Russian flag. But look how many dots representing the Iranian regime. This is a lot. They are basically controlling almost all Syria. Now we have this area controlled by the US-backed Kurds in the north and west of Syria, east of Syria. But at the same time, a lot of talk in the town was related to Iran, especially in the last 3 months with what happened in Lebanon. A lot of people thought that after the devastating attacks against Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Iranian regime is so weak that maybe they will not have revived Hezbollah for the next maybe few decades. Then all of a sudden, the rebels in this area started to move across the north, moving to this area in Idlib, as well as moving to Aleppo, and then to Homs, and all the way to Damascus. The Iranian presence in Syria is now almost zero. Maybe they have still, by international law, sovereignty over their embassy. But beyond that, not even around the sacred areas in Syria, the Shiite sacred areas, and Iran being a Shiite, ideologically identified as a Shiite regime, they were basically giving excuses for their involvement in Syria to protect the sacred sites, the Shiite sacred sites. Not even on those sides, you would see any Iranian presence. So what happened now is basically the retreat of the Iranian, the kind of vanishing Iranian presence, almost vanishing of the Russian presence. There are reports that Russia is, as of today, still kind of evacuating its military base in Latakia and Tartus. And basically, they don't have a legitimate reason to stay because the current regime in Syria, I can talk about it later, is basically not recognizing Russia as a neutral force like Britain or France, with which they had some talks recently. They consider Russia as an enemy. Why? Because Russia was involved heavily in 2015 to basically save the regime by attacking the exact people who are now in control of Damascus. So they don't like Russia, they don't like Iran, and obviously they are in favor of Turkey, who is now basically playing behind the scenes. We don't know how much they are involved, but definitely heavily involved, not only in the political maybe arrangement for the future of Syria, but also they have militias that are still affiliated with Turkey. They have been giving the money, they have been giving the training, and they have been giving basically a label to basically serve Syria. They were called the Syrian National Army. Well, national for me is sarcastic because it's not national for Syria, it's national for Turkey. They are serving the interest of Turkey. I don't want to go into further details, but I have two things to say. I have written two books, and this is definitely not marketing my books, but definitely it will help if you want to, as a student, if you want to be like enlightened about the background of what's happening in Syria. You need to know what happened in the Arab Spring revolutions. And I have a book, you can find it in the library, covering that, the revolts in the 2011 and after. And I also wrote a book on Syria called The Historical Dictionary of the Syrian Civil War and Revolution. The introduction of that book, I think, will map the same players here. There is a section called External Players, and I emphasize that even the future of Syria will depend on these external players, Turkey, Russia, and obviously the West. The West is highly involved, and now they are meeting in Jordan, the Brits, the US intelligence and military representative to see how much they can be involved in the dynamics of Syria. I will end by an anecdote. There is a movie called, a Western movie called Two Mules for Sister Sarah by Clint Eastwood. In the opening scene, there is this character. There are 2 or 3 bandits trying to attack Sister Anan. Her name is Sarah. And then the protagonist, Clint Eastwood, is saving her and basically shooting them and killing them. And then as Anan, she behaves in that character and said, I want to bury them properly. It was in summer. He said, sister, I don't mind shooting them for you, but I'm not gonna sweat for them or for you. So I think the Russians and the Iranians basically were saying exactly the same thing for Assad. We don't mind shooting people for you, but we can't keep sweating for you. The regime has been under very heavy sanctions. The morale among the Syrian army, amongst the Syrian people, was too low. And basically, it's understandable why Russia and Iran is now out of the picture from Syria for a while. And by that, I'll just move the floor to my colleagues. And maybe I would love to have questions from students, from other members of the audience, so we can engage in a conversation.
You should also mention Shirley MacLaine, who is Sister Sarah, as a first-year law student contracts, there was a contract dispute between her and the studio we had to study, the reported case.
And with due respect to the Iranian Shia ideology, Sister Sarah turned out not to be a nun, but the opposite of the nun. So.
That, no offense taken by me. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction to the conflict, because I think it really sets a scene for the geopolitics of what just has happened that I'm going to speak to. If you wouldn't mind actually leaving that map maybe on, because I'm going to talk about the regional politics around us that perhaps precipitated the fall of Assad regime, and will no doubt dictate the days and weeks and months to come. I want to begin with Iran and Russia, because they seem to be the 2 countries that are mentioned most in terms of both having really suffered in losing a key ally in Syria and Bashar al-Assad, but also really materially being now pushed out of Syria. I think we'd be hard-pressed to understand what has happened over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks without appreciating what came before it in the preceding 6 months, and the very highly escalated proxy war between Israel and the Islamic Republic, in which the Islamic Republic decisively was neutralized in its forward-facing bases in Syria and in Lebanon, and in places where it was not physically present, but was materially supporting, such as in the Gaza Strip and among the Palestinian movements struggling against Israeli occupation. You cannot underestimate the extent to which the Revolutionary Guards, especially their elite forces, were so precisely decimated by the Israeli intelligence and military operations. I don't think this will be a controversial maybe comment to make, but I don't think you will see the fall of Bashar al-Assad if you do not have the kind of focused, disciplined, ruthless military and intelligence campaign against the heads of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, Hezbollah command and control in Lebanon, including the Secretary General, and the very brazen signaling that the Israeli intelligence and military sent to the Iranian leaders by going inside Iran and assassinating Ismail Haniyeh in one of the most heavily guarded intelligence apartments in a fairly well-protected area, but also following all that, demonstrating their ability to penetrate Iranian airspace and targeting Iranian major military assets of Iran, especially its nuclear apparatus. I think that sent a shiver up and down the spine of the leadership in the Islamic Republic that made them think twice as to whether, now that Assad is in trouble, they should actually invest further material, energy, further resources into rescuing him, because they themselves were so exposed. The only reason after the Arab uprisings in 2010 and 2011, the Assad regime held on to power is because it was so ruthlessly supported by the Revolutionary Guards, Iranian Revolutionary Guards. I mean, this map is really instructive. You see Iran's tentacles all over Syria. You know, by all measures, Syria was a protected state of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, through which, by the way, they not only just supported the Assad regime, but engaged in all manner of illicit economic activity. The outflow of drugs from West Asia all the way up to the Mediterranean and the European Union were all facilitated by the Revolutionary Guards. And it's amazing to read the reporting in the last week or so of how a lot of these networks are being exposed, and the Syrian rebels are going after them and demonstrating just how much the corruption of the Assad regime was complicit in acting as a proxy for getting drugs to the European markets with the Revolutionary Guard. So this is not just a political military alliance. There's a lot more to this that goes to the heart of it. So Iran, unquestionably the biggest loser of the fall of Assad regime. They literally lose a client state. They lose a supply route to Hezbollah, and their influence in the Arab-Israeli conflict has been all but cut off. Israel, the unquestionable winner to me of all that's happening, and in the last week and a half in the kind of muddy waters of post-Assad Syria, they've been bombarding Iranian assets and some Russian assets too, if you read some of the reporting today in the Financial Times, all over Syria, to make sure that there's no threats to the state of Israel coming out of Syria for a very long time to come. Russia is a much more of a mixed bag in that I always believed their military presence in Syria did not really amount to a kind of economic nourishment that the Iranians were, for instance, enjoying out of Syria. They were there as a kind of a geopolitical presence, as a check against American, European interests in the region, but by and large, they were a kind of a presence. That was it. That politically, they never really got involved to a levels that the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran did. And I think to the extent that they're pulling back, you also read a lot of news stories that they're talking to the new incoming leadership in Syria trying to influence and maybe extend their lease in some bases here and there. So I don't think we're going to see them disappear the way we're going to see the Iranians really disappear out of Syria for a little while. Turkey, another massive advantage over Syria. You mentioned, I think, the extent to which the support for the rebel incursions from the north without Turkish support was probably difficult to imagine. And you only have to read the headlines today. Donald Trump, who does all of us the service of reading out his daily presidential briefings to the rest of the world, said that Turkey was the reason why Assad ultimately was overthrown. And he'll remember that because they're acting like an unfriendly actor, he said, quote unquote, in the region. So he's been briefed that Turkish material support was probably key in Assad falling, and he wants to make sure that there's not a disadvantage there. And lastly, the United States and EU, it's remarkable how quiet that portfolio has been compared to all these other regional players in at least the news headlines. I think part of this is owing to the fact that we're in a transition period in the United States where there's not a clear policy that can be articulated. Everyone kind of can hint at what might be coming after Inauguration Day in the United States. But the US, just like Israel, has also been heavily engaged in bombarding ISIS cells inside Syria, going after pockets of what they perceive to be unfriendly entities that may or may not be part of the coalition that brought down Assad, to neutralize them in the meantime. So in many respects, this is a country right now that is without a sovereign authority at its head, and you have the countries around it jockeying for advantage. Some of them are neutralizing what would be hostile factions to them, and others are going after what they think are the proxies of other powers around it that they may be neutralizing. The one thing I'll mention as a last point here, because I also would like to get to your questions, the one unknown here is the fate of the Kurdish rebel population that is sandwiched between what will be eventually, once again, a sovereign Syrian state and Turkish control in the north. There is a long history of the Kurdish populations doing their bit to bring down dictators and forces that were on high stuff, only to be then sacrificed by the new order of things. So I would watch that space very closely. I think the US CENTCOM and State Department have personnel that are especially trying to mediate between the Turkish government and the Kurdish leader, but how long that would last, it's anyone's guess, given that we have a very transactional administration coming into Washington in January.
Thank you very much. I do have opinions and thoughts, more important than my opinions are my thoughts about the geopolitics of what's happening. I agree with most of what my colleagues have said. I have some questions and maybe some disagreements on the margin, but I'm going to reserve those for when we discuss, hopefully, during the question and answer period. I am a lawyer, so I tend to look at situations such as has occurred in Syria from that perspective, particularly with my background, having attempted, excuse me, and largely failed in the effort to reconstruct a post-Ba'athist Iraq. And so the fall of another Ba'athist regime, which despite being from the same party, was in fact a rival to the Ba'ath party in Iraq, a rival faction to the Ba'ath party in Iraq. But that sort of history invokes my, if I may call it that, considering it has not ended well, expertise, which is not the word I intended to use, but in any event, my experience, sorry, that's the word I intended to use, my experiences in the effort to rebuild Iraq, because I think the Syrians have the opportunity to learn from the mistakes that we made in Iraq and hopefully to have a better future than so far the Iraqis have been able to make for themselves. I have several premises in beginning to think sort of in an institutional capacity about what's happening in Syria. Let me state those premises, and I'll try to do this as quickly and efficiently as my colleagues have done without any promises. And the first is acknowledging the obvious, that Syria is a deeply traumatized society, as all post-conflict societies are. As we've heard from Dr. Pearson, the civil war lasted more than 13 years, or some 13 years, and the supreme irony of the remarkable degree of violence to which the regime and its allies, including Lebanese and Iraqi militias, the Russians and the Iranians, subjected the Syrian populations to, the extreme violence to which the Syrian population was subjected by the regime in Syria. In light of, let us recall that the initial demands of the demonstrators in Damascus was not the fall of the regime as it was in other parts of the so-called Arab Spring, but reform. And it was even reform, Islah, that was too much for the regime. Let me also say, and I say this from experience with all respect to my Syrian friends and colleagues, the trauma may be deeper than the Syrians realize. I say this from the experience of Iraqis. We did not understand, and I'm one of the fortunate few whose parents fled Iraq before the worst of the excesses. We did not understand the extent of the trauma until after the fact. Now, to the extent that Iraq remains, in my view, a deeply dysfunctional, both in the immediate aftermath of the war in 2003 and likely still is, as I said, I think the Syrians can learn some lessons. I think Iraq is a more salient example due to the violent nature of the change, and as we've seen, the number of foreign actors in Syria than, say, Egypt and Tunisia. Let's leave Libya, which is an utter and complete failure, aside altogether. Now, both Egypt and Tunisia, however, are relevant because, as a lesson that democratic transitions might abort entirely, as it did in Egypt and, as it did ultimately in Tunisia so far, and may actually result in a worse situation than the beginning state. One of my givens in life is things can always get worse. Just because there's been change, there's no guarantee that things will actually get better. So let me say there are three basic points I'd like to make, and I'm going to try to go a little faster. I'm not going to take them in this order, but let me just state them as I have them in my notes. The first is there's going to be a natural tendency towards score settling. We have already seen some of this occurring in Damascus and other places. If the current powers that be in Syria do not control this process, it will get worse predictably. The second is that there will be a tendency to want two things: early elections and early constitution writing, both of which should be avoided. Now, let me take them in a different order. Let me start with early elections. There will be pressure from the international community, including states that are meeting, and sorry, I forgot who said they're meeting in Jordan, and the United Nations itself, which has a unit within the UN, mostly located at the UNDP, which will want to play a role in overseeing early elections and then followed by immediate constitution writing. And the Syrians themselves naturally will want that. And nevertheless, I think that pressure should be resisted. The problem was encountered in both Iraq and in Egypt, I would say. where we ended up with a situation where, let's set the Kurds aside for a moment. It is the religious parties that predictably are likely to be more well organized than any other political faction in the country. And there are a number of reasons for this, part of which is because religious parties tend, for instance, to organize in the mosques. And so it is much harder to control their ability to do so, even by despotic regimes, whether in Baghdad or in Damascus. And so other political factions will not be as well organized. I say this sort of not because I have particular knowledge of Syria, but just that is the experience of both Iraq and Egypt, which had very different transitions, but they have that at least in common. And the problem with that is it's fine if people want a more religious dispensation, that's fine. The problem is that elections, which if they're held early, the elections are always a snapshot, always. It's not clear to me if you ran the election we just had, this month, you'd get the same result necessarily. So they're always a snapshot. That's not much of an objection. The problem is, if this is the election that is going to result in the drafting of a constitution, and that is going to be the pressure, what you're going to get is a disproportionate, or rather non-representation, sort of a non-representational dispensation that nonetheless will set the future for the next. And if you held the elections in 5 or 10 years, you might get a very different result. Now, that's a point I'll come back to. Now, the political science literature, and I'm not a political scientist, and this could be outdated for all I know, but in the 90s and the early 2000s, the political science literature showed, it seems to me convincingly or persuasively, that early elections are often a factor contributing to the short-circuiting of democratic consolidations for some of the reasons I've just talked about, especially in post-conflict, deeply traumatized society. You may entrench new oligarchs. You may encourage in deeply traumatized societies electorates to cling to divisive divisions, such as clan, religious, sect, whatever it may be, rather than forging a common national identity, because there hasn't been time to consider, much less come to conclusions about a common national goal. Russia is everybody's favorite worst example of this. And I don't say that early elections in Russia is the only reason you end up with a resurgent autocracy. But I think it is a reason. The counterexample, which is everybody's favorite counterexample, is South Africa, where in post-apartheid South Africa, the South Africans waited 5 years before holding their first elections. This is in a country where, notwithstanding a heinous apartheid regime, there still were functioning legal and constitutional institutions, such as, I was speaking to a colleague this morning, Stephen Biko died under torture in a South African prison on the 12th of September, 1977. There was an inquest into his death in apartheid-era South Africa. I'm not defending apartheid. Please do not misunderstand me. The point of my mentioning this is to say there were functioning legal institutions, which in countries like Syria, in countries like Iraq, is simply not the case. You cannot begin to number those who have died under torture, much less go searching for a record of an inquest into their deaths. This is not Syria now, a country where, in my opinion, forgive me as a non-Syrian, I'm just speaking as someone with experience, with the best interest of Syria at heart, this is not a country ready for early elections, in my opinion, any more than the Iraqis were. Early constitution writing, very similar, although there's not the same literature on early constitution writing, but it's another centrifugal force. And I can say that because I saw it myself. I was the principal legal drafter of the interim constitution in Iraq, and I saw the Iraqi identity evanesce in front of my eyes, overnight almost. What I believe, what I would advocate for, if asked, is a temporary modus vivendi designed at rebuilding the state. Because the state has not just been taken apart by the events of the last 13 years. The state has been effectively taken apart over the course of the last 54 years since Asaad Alsaleh became president of Syria. We could talk about that if anybody is interested, but let me just state it. I think this then would allow, hopefully, for a shared vision, at least on a way forward to emerge, where all stakeholders have a view, and avoid rushing into decisions on a final form of the state, which may cause regret 5 or 10 years from now, because amending a constitution once it's in place is extremely difficult. We haven't been able to do it in Iraq for 20 years, notwithstanding that in 2005 or 6, there actually was a parliamentary committee that put forward a series of constitutional amendments, but that have simply never been debated since. And in Egypt, it actually took a coup d'etat to change the constitution. There were other reasons for that. I would focus on building institutions, be they constitutional, political, legal, and especially important, and this is particularly where we failed in Iraq, the notion of a loyal opposition. Everything is done in Iraq by consensus. In Egypt, it's done by an authoritarian regime that is more authoritarian than the regime against which the population of Cairo protested in 2011. The people in the streets of Cairo and Maidan al-Tahrir and Liberation Square were better off under Hosni Mubarak than they are today under General Sisi. In Iraq, everything has to be done by consensus. There's no notion of being in opposition. This is deeply destructive of politics, in my view, and is a formula for impasses and the inability to mean 21 years after the American invasion of Iraq, we have not built a single school in Iraq, not a single new hospital. Corruption, of course, is the principal reason for that. Finally, score settling, let me just say very quickly, it's understandable and it occurs not just in Arab lands, it occurred in post-liberation Paris. So it happens everywhere. I do, as a lawyer, I advocate for a post-conflict justice mechanism. There are a couple of ways this can be done. There's more than the two I'm going to talk about. One is a domestic tribunal. The other would at best likely be some sort of hybrid international domestic tribunal. That is unlikely. If there is a true post-conflict justice system that doesn't just constitute what occurred in Romania when Ceausescu and his wife were just lined up against a wall and their execution videotaped. You can probably watch it on YouTube. If there's going to be a real system of post-conflict justice, it's likely to be at best a domestic tribunal. There is a literature that claims that post-conflict justice mechanism promotes healing. Let me say the social science literature does not bear out that claim. Nevertheless, there is a value in having such systems because retribution and punishment are perfectly valid theories of a criminal justice system. If the Syrians ever manage to get custody over Bashar al-Assad, I take it we're not trying to rehabilitate him. It is perfectly valid for the Syrian people to aspire to punish Bashar al-Assad and his supporters for what they have done to Syria. There also needs to be a truth commission. A trial is a particularly poor way of trying to establish the truth because the rights of the accused take center stage, not the trauma of the victim. The most famous Truth Commission, of course, is the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's a Truth Commission which allows the opportunities for victim narratives to be centered. The Iraqi experience, and I could talk for a long time about this, has utterly failed in this regard, although we tried the perpetrators of atrocities in Iraq post-2003 because the Iraqis, under American tutelage, established an exceptional tribunal, a tribunal d'exception, pardon my alleged French pronunciation, which is a nice Baghdadi accent in French pronunciation, which is a technical term. Those of you who've taken international law from me will hopefully know what that means. And that exceptional tribunal had only a retrospective jurisdiction specifically from the rise of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq until its fall. And what that means is it had no deterrent effect on the current political class in Iraq because the laws were exceptional, the procedures were exceptional. And so the current political class, which is itself engaged in atrocities against the people of Iraq, is totally immune from that process. And of course, the court was ultimately disbanded. What I have advocated for, and maybe next year you can read it in my book, since we're talking books, is what should have happened in Iraq was that the previous leadership should have been tried under the Iraqi penal code using the Iraqi code of criminal procedure. And that's what I advocate for Syria. And I'm sorry if I went long. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Let us open it up to questions. Alex, you have your hand up first.
Thank you very much for those very interesting presentations. I certainly have a lot of questions, but I keep it very short and only ask one. So we've talked about as you were mentioning, Russia and Iran and Lebanon and Iraq for supporting for keeping Bashar al-Assad in power. But I think it's also fair to say that at least until very recently, Syria's religious minorities, Christian, Druze, Alawites, were among the biggest supporters of the Assad regime. And so my question now is, do you think the loss of the support from the minority community played a major role in the fall of Assad? More importantly, what's going to happen to Syria's religious minorities now after the death of Assad? Because there's been many reports out of Syria, speaking of score settling with Dr. Istrabadi, who was mentioning that seems to be a lot of score settling with Syrian rebels engaging in ethnic cleansing of Christians and Alawites. And there's reports that the Druze community now wants to secede from Syria and join Israel, allegedly. I'm not sure how true those claims are, but I've seen it reported in several different outlets. So that's the question. What's the future for Syria's religious minorities? Are they going to face a similar fate that, say, Christians faced in Iraq after the fall of Saddam, or that Afro-Libyans faced after the fall of Gaddafi in Libya? Thank you very much.
Well, this is a good question. Obviously, when I said we received the news of the coupling of Assad with mixed feelings, I would say one of the major feelings was fear, because we are fearful of what's going to happen the next day, including the minorities, including, I was discussing this with one of my colleagues, professor of literature, an activist. She was concerned about the rights of women in the future for Syrian women. The minorities in Syria were never in support of Assad, by the way. The Alawites in the shore of Syria, the Sahel, were mostly in opposition of Assad simply because the dynamics of power are different. They were not affiliated with him based on tribal affiliations, but basically because he hired a lot of their youth to work for the regime. And those mostly labeled in Syria as Shabiha, yes, they happen to be from an Alawite background, But these are like any militia. You can see the same in Iraq. They don't represent necessarily the Shia or the Alawite pockets in Syria. Christians, they were not in support of Assad. They were worried about the other forces that were fighting Assad. Some of them were obviously extremists that wouldn't basically allow Christians to thrive in Syria. And Christians, as we know from history, they were basically the original national people in Syria. So the regime pretended that they would protect the minorities by fighting the extremists. But they were never in support of the regime just because they liked dictatorship, they liked the torture for their fellow Syrians, they liked the lack of economic opportunities. They were suffering. Same with the Druze. The Druze actually were in the news, good rhyming, for the last year because in Sweden, they were revolting. They have protests every single day. So Assad was losing that basically population base. Now, what's for their future? The good news, the rosy scenario so far is the administration now that basically holds all the shots in Syria. They gave many assurances regarding minorities. If you take their word, everything will be rosy. And I don't know why we wouldn't take their word because they are in power. And so far, they haven't basically done anything to antimize or antagonize the minorities, whether they are Druze, Christians, or Alawite. Yes, there were an accident where one of the former generals in the regime, who happened to be an Alawite, but he was also involved in torturing Syrians. He was treated vindictively by some rebels, and it was basically captured by video and went viral. A lot of Syrians are cheering for this, I would say, including Alawites. I'm not necessarily in the same mindset because this guy was irresponsible for ruthless atrocities against fellow Syrians, including Alawites who didn't give support to Assad. So in this transitional period, nothing indicates, and I'm not saying there are no reasons to be still fearful. There is nothing indicate that the minorities will be in danger because those who control now Syria, including the Kurds, are not giving any signals that they will treat the minorities differently.
If I can very quickly just say the problem of the de-Christianization of West Asia has been ongoing for a century. And it is, I would say, universally true of every single country that I can think of in West Asia. So you can say it's because of the fall of Saddam. Christians had been fleeing Iraq. There's an Assyrian American population that has been in this country since the 1920s, and so on. So the problem of de-Christianization, I mean, you take it back to probably the late 19th century, but it has accelerated through the 20th century and continues here. Whether you're talking, I'm not an expert on Iran, but I think it's true of Iran as well. Iran, Iraq, Syria, even Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and so on. So this has been ongoing for a long time. We tend to sort of notice it at these moments. Egypt is another example, but it's a much greater problem than who's ruling in Baghdad or Damascus or whatever. It's a whole nother discussion.
Our next question will come from Zoom. Bryce?
Yes, thank you for taking the question. And thank you for putting together this event. My question is about the Western influence that would help brought about the fall of Assad, and that will play an essential role in how the world engages with whatever new government that comes into power. One of the core reasons that the Assad military was so eroded was that the U.S. and Europe had a sanctions regime designed to do just that. I saw a report earlier today that at least the European Union said that they are planning to continue the sanctions if the new government refuses to kick Russia out of Syria. To me, that indicates that the policy of the West, now, I don't know what the American position on this is yet, but the policy of the West might be oriented towards broader geopolitical conflict rather than being in the interest of the Syrian people. And to add to this, I know that the U.S. currently and its allies occupy a sizable chunk of Syria, and at least according to the Assad government, they were taking a lot of the oil resources. I'm wondering how you guys see Western, both European and American, engagement with the new government. What conditions do you think there would be for a constructive engagement, or what prospects are there for uh, a softer hand against Syria?
You want me to take it? I'll take a stab at this. I mean, that's quite a bill of questions. I'll say first and foremost that sanctions may have been an ingredient, but not decisive in my estimation. There are many countries that have very severe U.S. sanctions against them, and European Union, Iran being the primary one, and thrive just fine. I really do think the deprivation of state support for Assad from Tehran and Russia eventually was the decisive blow, since that's what maintained him in power for the last decade after the uprising started anyway. In terms of U.S. Interest in Syria being broader, absolutely. I mean, the United States does not have, Russia does not have, great powers do not have. They have country-specific policies, but they're thinking about the region as a whole. And so, I think that U.S. has gotten a lot more clear-eyed in terms of its core interests in what has been for, again, a decade, a quasi-state in Syria. Let's not forget, Assad was in power, but he did not exercise full sovereign power over entire Syrian territory. There were huge swaths of Syrian land that were under the control of militias affiliated, backed up by a whole range of groups. And the United States just wanted to minimize any damage that might come to its interests out of those groups. And it shifted alliances all over the map. I mean, I think one of the mistakes that one could make in this particular moment is to read too much into headlines that are coming out on a daily basis, because they're contradictory. By the end of the week, you'll find that there are 3 different trends that completely contradict each other because the events are so fluid. I will say this, however, and this goes to the previous 2 comments. You now have in Syria, I mean, everyone should read their Thomas Hobbes, and a total vacuum of credible authority. Whenever you have over a geography a vacuum of credible authority, meaning that there's a person you could go to and say, dispatch this particular platoon and neutralize this threat. You don't have that in Syria. There's no credible Syrian government that can be independent just yet, and it might not come for some time. You will have meddling from outside, jockeying for power, and especially great powers seeking advantage. How committed is the United States to doing this, especially with an administration that's coming, that it's a lot more, let's cut our losses, move on, but also let's make deals in where we can. And a European Union that is internally very self-involved right now, the rise of far right. The European Union is no joke. But also in both countries, 2 Western powers, or blocs, we should say, that are acutely aware of the damage that came out of the Syrian civil war because of the issue of migration to the European Union, to the domestic politics of those countries. So I think there would be a serious interest in rebuilding something in Syria that could be durable, that wouldn't result in the flood of refugees and migrants into Europe or spread elsewhere. But whether we have the right politicians, the wise heads, as Professor Istrabadi mentioned, who can understand the lessons of the past and say building institutions is absolutely key in this moment, I'm skeptical. I think we're in a bad period in world politics where the quality of leadership does not match the scale of challenges that countries fail.
worldwide,
Worldwide.
not just in
That's right.
Syria, yeah.
That's right.
And we also need wise heads in the White House,
Yes.
not only in the Middle East.
That's right.
I want to make one comment, if I may, and that is not to, I would ascribe the precipitous fall of the Assad regime more to the inability of the Russians to prop him up at this moment, as opposed to the sort of degradation of Iran. I admit that played a role. I don't mean to say it didn't, but I really think the ramping up of support for Ukraine and the war there made the calculation for Putin very different in 2024 than it was in 2025. I suspect that the statement, if the Europeans in fact have said that, and I haven't seen that reporting, but that doesn't mean they didn't say it, it probably has a little more to do with keeping up the pressure on Russia than it actually has anything to do with the Syrians, which is unfortunate. There has not been an Iraq policy in the United States, I would argue, since Obama became president. I mean, W. Bush obviously had an Iraq policy, but since then, I don't think there has been one. And I fear, and it would be a huge mistake for the U.S. to repeat this mistake on the international community. I fear there's not going to be a Syria policy going forward either.
So in terms of the immigration problem.
One very quick follow-up. Syrians are suspecting any good outcome that might come from Western pressure, because a lot of Syrians are now dismayed that Israel is having a free hand to attack any place in Syria when the US is basically on a mute mode, simply because they don't care even to say for lip service that, hey, this is a sovereign state, still the land is sovereign, even if
To
there
which
is.
international law applies. Yes.
Exactly, that you shouldn't attack Syria, you shouldn't occupy further land in Syria. So I would say even the administration in Syria, the current Syria, might not take that pressure seriously because they see how the Western powers are not being honest when they deal with the neighbor to Syria, Israel. Go
So in
ahead.
terms of immigration, they had a big diaspora group in Europe as well as in Turkey. And then they had been establishing their networks, not only for transition period, as well as for the finances, for the trade. And also in Idlib, I think different than other Arab regions, they had a semi-local organization of governing. So they have some kind of experience. And then we can say it's maybe 4, 5, 6 million people. It's more than some European countries the size. Do you think the new transitional group can take advantage of these two dynamics, and then they can use also their diaspora rather than sending new educated people and then make them come back and then serve in the country? It's a general question for.
The experience, refugees don't tend to go back. That's the experience of the world for the last 80 years. So 12 years is a long time.
So but in terms of the European case, every country is different, but Austria is just announced that they stopped all the asylum. And then Turkey, they had never been given.
Wait until you see Austria try to round up immigrants. How did it go the last time Central Europeans were rounding up people in large numbers? It's very easy to say all that. It's another thing to do it it's another thing entirely to do it. I'm very skeptical, and we're going to see it maybe here in the U.S. The rounding up of immigrants.
Ramazan, you know, maybe Turkish news. I heard that 1 million Syrians went back to Syria, losing their kimlik, the permanent or the residence status in Turkey.
In Turkey, based on the constitution, only Turkic states can get permanent status. So only, I think, 300,000 were given citizenship, but none can take permanent status. So none of them had, but they were renewing their status. And then Erdogan clarified this from the beginning, even the opposition used it as a ploy to punish Erdogan always. He said, if they're not volunteers, they will not go. So as long as Erdogan is in power, they will not be pushed. But if Erdogan loses the power, they will be, of course, taken out.
one thing also that led to the demise of Assad is the refugee question, because a lot of Europeans were not happy about how the refugee crisis has never been stopped or even started to be negotiated. Assad refused to have a meeting with Erdogan,
Yeah,
who
yeah.
was not looking forward to having a cup of tea with Assad or nothing. The refugees were the main topic. And he declined to do anything about this invitation. I think one of the major mistakes he had done this year. And therefore, I think the Europeans will invest a lot to have a stable Syria that will basically, eventually, I hope, will be a safe haven for Syrians to go back to their country.
What are they gonna go back to?
There are many areas in Syria, you would be surprised, that are vacuum, like not villages, complete villages that the regime kind of displaced.
Half the population has been internally and externally
That's
displaced.
correct.
There was a statistic I read years ago, there were more school-age children, Syrian school-age children in Lebanon than Lebanese school-age children. I mean, that's startling if it was true. So I'm very skeptical, but hope springs eternal.
Well, I have a different comment. First thing about the refugees in Lebanon. Lebanon is not providing much help to the refugees, and that makes it very difficult for them to stay in Lebanon. Turkey is a different story, but I would like to comment on Ambassador Istrabadi's comment on what happened to 2004-05 in Iraq, and I am older than him. I can report on the Iraqi coup that happened in 1958. And I am following the television from Aleppo directly when they pass group by group by group to Damascus. And I remember also what happened of the coup in July in Iraq, where everybody loves everybody, it's a peace, no crime, an ideal situation. And it took only 30 days when the conflict started. The communists wanted to control, the Ba'athists wanted to control. And that brings us with Professor Istrabadi's point about delaying it to having a constitution first. Now the question, what will happen if we have a delay in establishing a constitution and parliament? The period between now and stability where the country will be more stable to live.
The coup, as you know, is on the 14th of July, 1958, and on the 15th of July, 1958, some families had members of them killed.
I know.
That day,
Yeah.
as you well know.
I know. Yeah.
Not saying anyone in particular, just the speaker's
Yeah.
family. So what happens? Let me give you an example in post-2003 Iraq. The most contentious issue in Iraq post-2003. In 2003, when the Americans got to Baghdad, and now is oil. And who controls Iraq's oil? As you know, this is a dispute between Baghdad and Erbil, which is ongoing, and the permanent constitution is ambiguous about the issue. We were able to resolve that issue in a document that I was the principal legal drafter, which was the Transitional Administrative Law. We didn't call it a constitution. I grant you, it functioned operationally, de facto, as a constitution. But we deliberately, for several reasons, didn't call it a constitution. We were able to resolve the dispute about control of the oil on a temporary basis in favor of Baghdad, greater centralized control in Baghdad on the issue of oil, because it was a temporary document, because there was a commitment to revisit the issue later. Now, in the case of Iraq, that later was within a few months, granted. I grant you that. But there was an agreement that allowed greater centralized control than the Kurds wanted. On other political issues, the Kurds got greater autonomy, probably, than most of the Arab parties in Baghdad wanted. And that was the trade. So it was a modus vivendi, a way of moving forward together, which did not finally settle all issues. If we had proceeded for another 4 or 5 years with that understanding and then written a permanent constitution, I have no doubt that the final constitution is what we call permanent constitution. Of course, there's no such thing, but in distinction to the transitional law, the final resolution of these issues would have looked different than it does now. The party, the Arab party, which was, to be more accurate, the Shi'i party, which drove the drafting of the permanent constitution in 2005, doesn't even exist anymore. But we're still living with that constitution. Al-Majlis al-A'la, the Supreme Council, doesn't even exist anymore. So this is my point. Obviously, you have to have a document which forms around which the political parties can agree that they will begin to build a new polity, begin to build new institutions. But by not making that document the document which will last, in the case of Iraq, 20 years, and since you mentioned the coup of 1948, remember, Iraq has been ruled by a series of interim constitutions since the 1958 coup, including the 1970 interim constitution, which was in effect until 2003 for 33 years, the longest constitution under which Iraq has ever been governed. If you can create a document that itself says this is not permanent, this is temporary, you can, I think, in a democratic atmosphere, you can begin to develop state institutions when the temperature is lower than when you get to the negotiations for a permanent constitution, as a State Department interlocutor said to me, this is for all the marbles. I just think that deeply traumatized societies should not have the added trauma of going for all the marbles immediately after change. Lower the temperature. Let us have a document that we agree will have 5 years. The problem with the Iraqi interim constitutions from 58 to 70 years, they said they were interim, but none of them had a sort of expiration date. The transitional administrative law did have an expiration date. It just should have been a little longer than it was, 5 years instead of 1 year, in my opinion.
Is Syria a bit ready for that?
5 years?
No, Syria, Karen.
No, I don't think so.
That's the whole question.
I don't think so.
That's what the question, yeah.
How? Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. In the case of the Kurds, in the last week, you see, I mean, Turkey feels as the winner, and it's obvious the Kurdophobia in Turkey because of it is Kurdish population as a fear of the next tensions. So Turkey trying to invade the Kurdish areas, already ethnic cleansed the town of Afrin, and now attacking Kobani, which I think it's Aleppo. So
Yes.
what do you think about the future of these tensions, Turkish tension in Syria?
Well, as you know, Turkey has permanent issues with some factions in the Kurdish,
Every factions, I mean,
yeah, especially the PKK, which is considered a terrorist organization, jointly considered by some even European powers. The US, I think, maybe I will refer to you, what is the status of that? But they rebranded themselves with Assad, and now they are, I would say, in the limbo, because who knows what's going to happen after Trump take over, because he might fail the Kurds. There are speculations that he might say, well, if Erdogan is the winner, he has been already blowing his horn, then maybe we should all leave it to one Syria. The Kurds won't have US backing, and they have to negotiate with the current administration, which they are already in the process.
But my question
But
is,
now with Turkey, I know Turkey, like Israel in Syria or towards vis-a-vis Syria, there should be some international pressure against Turkey as well as Israel not to go too far in the way they try to kind of settle their affairs on the Syrian land. So I don't think Syrians can prevent that from happening, but maybe the international pressure on Turkey would help. Same with Israel. So I don't know how much of latitude Syrians have to prevent Turkey from doing something or some damage to the Kurds inside Syria.
but I mean, the Kurdish minority issue in the Middle East, if Turkey is not prevented, it will lead to civil war within Syria for a long
Sure,
time, just
I
like
agree.
Turkey had.
I
I
agree.
mean, so
Yeah, that's a mahalla, but it's possible. That's why, as I said, we have external players in Syria. I am not an expert on Turkish affairs, but definitely we need to know what is Turkey's next plan towards the Kurds, towards the rebels who were trained in Turkey and ready, almost like a hired gun
If I may
to
add
fight
on
for
that.
Turkey.
They will never
So the
allow.
PKK has been.
Hang on, are there other questions? Sorry,
There are, yes.
let's get to
And,
it. As soon as Dr. Saleh is finished.
but I think Ramazan wants to
Yes,
give a
related
feedback.
to that, yeah.
Go ahead.
So I think, I can then clarify the,
Please say.
I will then respect Faisal Istrabadi's
Please,
comments.
very quickly, we need to move on as well,
Yeah, sure.
because you've had a chance, several chances, in fact.
still on the question, we are trying to understand.
I
the thought,
understand,
right?
but there are others.
Yeah, so I think the main question, rather than, for the YPG, Turkey clarified that they don't want to let it go there.
Mhm.
Also, I think the Arab tribes have a problem right now, because for the YPG, they're now controlling almost half of the Syria, which is around about, I think, 5 to 10% of the population. So I think the question should be for us to understand how Arab tribes are also willing to give the land for the YPG. Because there are problems between Kobani and the Iraqi Kurdistan as well, how they're going to handle, as well as the PKK. So I think there are three Kurdish groups having a problem for the faith and the future of Syria. That should be studied as well. That's
Yeah.
a more important question. Please.
Thank you. Thank you. It's, from my understanding so far, it sounds like the Syrian land has like a number of different national or military actors that are interested in doing their business there, right? And I'm wondering if you could add more color to the tangible outcomes that surrounding nations have to gain from having power over that land. Like, it sounds like there's a military basis if we can defend ourselves, or there's supporting and I guess like defending trade routes, but especially in a place where there are a number of economies that are heavily sanctioned or that may rely on an illegal economy. What do, I guess, like surrounding nations have to gain from taking that land, as well as what tangible outcomes does that have for the people there?
I mean, I'll say quickly, I think there are a range of areas in which when you have a country that has a vacuum of power, centralized power obtained. One is there's going to be not so much interest in grabbing strategic areas. I mean, Israel's neutralizing strategic areas of threat to it. The Russians are trying to negotiate to hold on maybe to Tartus or Latakia or whatever, have some sort of presence area over there. Ultimately, I think the interest here is to make sure outside powers, they want to check the power of other powers that they see as their incursions perhaps coming at the expense of their interests in Syria. But in the absence of having a solid identity of what the Syrian government is, what it looks like, there's going to be a lot more of guessing games, people kind of betting on a short term, on a militia here, on a group there. That's why I think it's so crucial in the next few weeks for there to be a centralized interim government put in place, supported maybe by a coalition of, or maybe the United Nations, to be recognized as the official government, and then talk about all the timelines for various other issues that have been brought up, so that other powers at least have to reference someone when they're violating Syrian sovereignty. Until that happens, you're going to have daily violation of Syrian sovereignty, as we're seeing right now. I mean, and don't count the Iranians completely out. I mean, you don't see this many flags just melting overnight. They're also reloading, recalculating what are the parties that they can buy off, that they can work, pit against each other, et cetera. They had a master class of this in Iraq over the last 20 years. They're very well trained, they understand how to conduct business in countries that are chaotic, and keeping them chaotic and weak ultimately is the interest of major powers in the region, like Turkey, like Iran. I mean, a weakened, a quasi-independent Syria is the wish that all the neighbors of Syria have. This is realism 101. Don't have a strong state emerge that could have chemical weapons or what have you. So make sure we just make it a kind of a, you know, a place that doesn't pose a threat to us. That's number one. And then you have a bunch of sectarian interests that have always been in play over there. You know, the different factions that were mentioned, you know, between Sunni, Shia, Christian, Kurdish, Druze. I mean, you're going to have those kind of sectarian issues always bubble underneath, but ultimately from a regional power perspective, keeping Syria weak and quasi-independent is the wish of all the neighbors of Syria. I've become very cynical about this because I've seen the hopes of transition, a democratic transition in Iraq go up in smoke. You've seen, you know, one of the contexts that
Hope springs eternal.
I know, but one of the contexts that I think in the case of Iraq as a case study is so important to keep about, they failed to get an electoral democracy off the ground with the protection of the US military around the building of institutions. I mean, you don't even have that in Syria. You don't have a central great power, you know, stationing 150,000 troops saying, let's have an interim government in place. I mean, the challenge for Syria is far greater than what the Iraqis even were facing in 2003, which was the United Nations, the EU, the United States, all coming in. They still were driven out by factionalism and violence here and there. So in Syria, you can only imagine how much steeper the climb is. And on top of that, I mean, I think you cannot underestimate, I come back to this, the dynamic between Israel and Iran. Israel right now is on this offensive war footing. The gloves are off. They have green light from all intents and purposes from Washington. The Europeans can't do anything about it. And they've been bombarding everything that is within their sights. This is the Netanyahu strategy going forward, and then, you know, seeing where things settle down. I'm very skeptical about us having the kinds of conversations we had around the year 2011 to 2014 about what might happen in post-dictatorships, especially given the balance of power globally and the kind of quality of leadership that is coming to power in Europe, that's coming to power in the United States, and in the region as well. So it's one of those things that where you have to, like, really, it's a day-to-day monitoring. You can't have a template for it.
I could, on the geopolitics, just one sentence. Israel's actions in Syria, I think, are playing into Iran's hands in the intermediate term, or maybe the long term. So I wouldn't count Iran out entirely of the Syria equation, because at some point you're going to get a government in Damascus which wants its territory back. Israel is now occupying not the Golan Heights, but Syria proper. And that is not sustainable.
And that will also embolden Turkey to do whatever it wants in Syria. So if the US is really caring about the Kurds, they should have maybe sent a message to Israel to stop doing what they are doing in Syria, so that the Turks won't feel encouraged to do the same.
And it needs to be pointed out that Turkey is also occupying sovereign democratic territory.
It has been.
And has been for years.
Question back corner.
I want to ask, Since 2017, HTS has been governing Idlib, a population of 4 million people, through the Syrian Salvation Government. Have they demonstrated they're capable of governing?
That's a good question. There are mixed feelings about how they function. A lot of people were happy that there are no attacks from the regime. They felt that's a great accomplishment, thanks to the agreement with the Turkish government that they would protect that area. Beyond that, the economy was horrible. There were tension between what we call the revolutionaries, the rebels, who were basically chanting in the streets against Assad. They were suppressed by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham because they are mostly secular and they are anti-jihadist, anti-Islamist ideologies. We can't, to be fair to them, we can't judge their performance in Idlib to say this is how they're gonna do it in Syria, because they were also, their hands were tied. They didn't have resources. They didn't have recognition. They were just working to make things on a daily basis functional to the refugees. And they were overpopulated, overworked, understaffed, and no support. Now they have an opportunity. The leader of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham said, now we have more resources and we are looking for everyone to stretch the hand of help so that we can build a stronger and an inclusive Syria.
And then quick follow-up. I've been looking into this a lot. I'm having trouble finding a statistic for it. I've only found one, and it was from the Resistance News Network, the mouthpiece of the Axis of Resistance, so it's obviously biased. They claim that 30% of HTS is foreign-born soldiers. Is there truth to this?
I would say this is exaggerated. There were more in 2012, 13, 14, mostly Saudis coming to participate in what they thought as a sacred duty to launch jihad against what they called a non-Muslim regime. But since then, many of them went back because they were not victorious. They failed in their mission, and therefore they didn't find any reason to stay in Idlib. So the current population of HTS is mostly Syrians. They were easy to hire because a lot of densely populated youth in the north, in Idlib, they are ready to take maybe $100 a month to basically be recruited by that group and to be ready for what they promised, and since they fulfilled the promise, to be the conquest of Damascus and the conquest of Syria. So far, I don't see a pattern of foreigners as we were concerned in 2012, 13. Nobody is talking about that element.
Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. My question is directed to my colleague, Professor Banai. I do agree with you that I think Iran is one of the major losers in this one, no doubt about it. Now, if we were to give you the crystal ball, could you tell us what will happen internally in Iran? And what we have seen in the last 3-4 years with the women freedom life. So what do you think will happen to Iran? I mean, they're very worried about it from what I read.
They are. I mean, I think one of the, this could be, may or may not be, I mean, we've been fooled many times, a black swan event for Iran. Over the last 2 weeks, there have been a lot of internal conversations about the money wasted in Syria among hardliners in Iranian newspapers. I mean, open kind of disputes. Iran, roughly, if you believe the rough estimate, has spent over $30 billion propping up Assad since 2011. And many more in 6,000 soldiers dead. They had put together, militias that recruited, Afghans, Central Asians to go and fight in Syria. There are open questions as to why is the strategy failing so badly. And again, this is coming on the heels of them getting humiliated by the repeated successive Israeli attacks, assassination of Quds Force leaders, assassination of Nasrallah, Ismail Haniyeh, no shortage of kind of the top figures around the office of the supreme leader. People have even asked for an assessment of the supreme leader's mental acuity over this. Is it him or is it someone else? You have to understand that inside Iranian politics, the Revolutionary Guards run their own mini state with its own secretive budget and with its own foreign and domestic policies. That mini state within a state is in a crisis right now, but there's no other powerful force inside Iranian politics to hold it accountable. So failure has been brought up by the IRGC, but who holds IRGC accountable inside Iranian politics? No one. They're the most powerful force. There is a succession crisis looming in Iran. Khamenei is getting very close to his eventual demise. And, you kind of read on a weekly basis speculations about this kind of catastrophic axis of resistance that Iran has brought up that has brought nothing but costs under severe regime of international sanctions economically to it, but also a rise in corruption, massive corruption, right? That has come out of all this. And so those conversations are interesting that they're happening, that they tend to be episodic. They last for a couple of weeks and then the regime kind of takes the conversation in the back rooms and they start to having those private conversations. I don't foresee this kind of being a domino effect unless there is a major military confrontation between Israel and Iran. If there's been a lot of questions whether Iran sees this as more reasons to go rush to get a bomb or not, I'm very skeptical. I think Israel demonstrated that it understands Iran's nuclear programs better than Ayatollah Khamenei does. They have infiltrated Iran's intelligence within the IRGC elite units. It's very clear. The commander of the Quds force is spotted having an ankle bracelet because they're worried that he might be a spy. After the pagers blew up in all over Lebanon, it showed that a level of sophistication, infiltration of Iranian intelligence that they understand stretches all the way into their nuclear program. So most of the advantage right now is in Israel's hands. I think you watch Israel and Iran, where these two countries are going, you can sort of see where the fortunes of the kind of countries that they've have their influence and might ebb and flow. But in terms of Iranian politics, I don't have a crystal ball that extends beyond the week on Iran, I'm afraid.
Can I ask a follow-up to that? There's my impression before the last couple of months, wrong though it may be, but my impression was the IRGC could hold a reasonable facsimile of the regime together. Assuming that was ever true, do you think they can hold, or are they actually losing control internally, the IRGC specifically?
I mean, it's such a difficult question to answer because we don't have much insight into the inner workings of the organization itself. And I would wager the only organization that it does is probably Mossad. In terms of that knows what is happening, what they're thinking, how they're communicating with each other, et cetera. So whether they can, whether the post-Khamenei future is a kind of a military junta a la Pakistan or Myanmar, I don't know. But that's one of the models certainly that's very possible because of the sheer economic control they have inside the Iranian state. I mean, the economy is a very important angle here. There's a lot of money that was made on the backs of people's miseries, right? In Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, that has really enriched the Iranian Revolutionary Guard to such an extent that they were, the sanctions had no effect on them. They washed the money very easily in many other places, and Syria was a very important staging ground. So the loss of that will be felt, but they already have their kind of release valves in the Persian Gulf monarchy states. So I'm sure, that there'll be something happening there. I mean, it's a good question as to what other Sunni Arab states might come in and, try to fund. I mean, Saudi Arabia, this might be a very good opportunity for them to, become a player in Syria. Will they? I don't know. I haven't been following that portfolio that closely.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. If you could join me. For more in the spring, we'll try to keep abreast of events in the Middle East, although they seem to go faster than we are able to think. So
Yes.
thank you all. Have a great break, and we'll see you in 2025. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.